Let's hope it records this time. All right, guys. Genesis chapter 1. So, what I want to try and do today is I want to try and have a semi-discussion / teaching moment here with you guys. So, we look at the world through whatever lens we look at the world, you know. It's not just your eyes that look at the world. It's the way that you think. It's the way that you perceive the reality that is coming your way. And that reality is developed through many different inputs, and if I can call it, I don't want to call it media, because people, you know, immediately say media, they think CNN or Fox News or whatever. But you receive information through many different forms of media from the outside world. And your perception is very often skewed by things that happen to you in your life. And so a lot of questions arise in people's minds as they go through life. And one of these big questions that people ask and have been trying to answer for millennia is, where do we come from? What are we doing here? What are we supposed to be doing here? And where is there something after this, or is this it? Is this the beginning and is this the end? Now, over the centuries, over the millennia that human beings have traversed the planet, there have been a lot of theories that have presented themselves. People have been praying to gods for as long as we can remember, as long as we've got written proof from ancient civilizations that people have had something that they believed outside of the reality that their eyes, their ears, and their senses can perceive. People have always believed that there's something extra-worldly at play. Now, there's a lot of theories about why that is. You know, we have, from the beginning of time, religious belief, and most of these religions were related to what they call polytheism. So for every type of event, or everything that goes right in your life, or everything that goes wrong in your life, there was some god or some spirit or some otherworldly influence that was affecting you, and that was taking you down this road. And a lot of people still believe in a lot of that stuff. One of the most famous quotes you'll ever hear from atheists and others is that us as Christians, they'll say to us, yeah, you know, why are you so invested in trying to convert me to Christianity? Don't you understand that you don't believe in 2,999 gods? I just don't believe in one more than you. It's a very interesting quote, right? So, and it's quite a difficult one to try and argue, right? Because people that live in a sort of what they call the easiest word to use is a proof mentality. People want you to prove to them the existence of God. They want you to, you know, they want, it's called evidentiary proof. In other words, you must be able to physically show them God, like I can show you like this camera, or show you that pot plant, or whatever it is. You must be able to physically show them God before they'll believe you. But, in the same token, they cannot disprove. It's impossible to disprove the existence of God. because if we base our burden of proof on the same level that they base their burden of proof, and we bring our evidence of why we believe in God versus their evidence why they don't believe in God, all right? There's no proving by showing something physical or not being able to show something physical that either proves or disproves God. You with me? So as much as I can't say to you, I can prove to you empirically with scientific evidence and this and that there is a God, you cannot prove to me with scientific evidence that there is no God. Because you can bring both sides of the equation and both bring very, very good arguments. You understand? So if you take some of the most famous scientists in the world, like Richard Dawkins and these types of people, they'll say to you, we have established through hypothesis and theorizing and based on what we see and what we can test, that the entire universe is just a random, it's based on random events that coexisted at the perfectly right time to create everything you see, and that randomness has continued right through all of the history of the earth and the history of the universe. But then, within their own scholarly debate, there's other scientists that will tell you that's not true. Everything has got, if you look at how everything works, there's definitely some kind of system at play that is keeping everything together and is keeping everything tied together. It's impossible for it to just be a random collection of events that spawn forth all these random other events that ultimately bring us to where we are now as human beings sitting on a tiny speck of dust. Because that's literally what we are. We're an organism sitting on a tiny speck of dust, hurtling through the universe at unbelievable speeds. So, I can look it all up for you. I've read all the stuff, but I can't just remember all the speeds offhand. So like the Earth spins around its own axis at a certain speed. Then it's traveling around the sun at a certain speed. Then the sun is traveling around in the solar, the whole solar system is then traveling around the galaxy at a certain speed. And each speed is incrementally faster than the next speed. And then the galaxy is spinning around at an unbelievable speed. And then around us are other galaxies with other solar systems and other things that are spinning around at an unbelievable speed. And then what they've deduced from all of that is that the entire universe is thus spinning around. Now, with these new telescopes and that, they say that they can see far enough to see because light travels at a certain speed, and if you can see far enough, all right, you can then judge by how long it takes the light to come from where it's coming to the camera, how far away that object is that's creating the light, okay? Based on the distance that the camera is focused. Now, we're talking about cameras the size of buildings that are out in space, right? And they're saying that they can see the beginning of the universe. They say they can see the Big Bang, is what they say. And based on that, they've then measured the size of the universe, and they say that the size of the universe is expanding continually, and because the universe is expanding continually, we can expect further random events, blah, blah, blah. But then the Christians come and say, well, in order for a universe to expand, it must have a beginning. Right? You can't say something is expanding without a start. Right? And if something has a beginning, then it must have an end. So if it started there, where does it end? All right? And then what is outside? Outside of it. So in other words, back in the day, early scientists would tell you that the universe was never ending and there was no beginning to it and there was no end. Okay? That's more of a biblical concept, if you understand what I'm saying. But now scientists are saying, and then they argued against that because we jumped on that and said, yeah, that's like God, There is no beginning, there is no end. So they will say to you, all right, if the universe has no beginning and no end, then, it's easy for you to understand that God has no beginning and no end. So now they developed the theory, no, the universe definitely has a beginning and definitely has an end. And therefore, there can't be something other than the universe that has got a beginning and an end, because nothing like that has ever existed. You understand? So then we would come back and say, well, then what is outside the universe? Because if it has a beginning and an end, there must be something outside of that beginning and something outside of that end. What is that? You with me? So you can argue in any direction and you can make valid arguments. I don't know everything there is to know about it, but I know enough to understand that, for every thesis there's an antithesis or an antithesis, all right? So how does this answer your question? What are we doing here? How did we get here? Why are we here? This is a question that has been asked from your dot, So I watched old Ken Hovind, he's the much aligned and much criticized and even been arrested for tax evasion pastor / physicist / quantum physicist, I believe, who has tried to explain these things in a manner that people can understand. So in order for you to get here, you as a human being, right, you had to be made by a male and a female, correct? Okay? So then Ken Hovind would ask this question: which one evolved first, male or female? Because if they evolved, it would make sense that one would have to evolve before the other one, and if one evolved before the other one, then how did they create the next one? Which is a flippant simple question, but how do you answer it? Which came first, the chicken or the egg type of thing? But which came first, the mother or the father? Because without the mother or the father, you can't create the individual. It's impossible. It can't be done. I think there's 2 or 3 organisms on this planet, maybe a few more, that can self-procreate, that are what they call hermaphrodite, like an earthworm. An earthworm is male and female in one, right? And I believe there's certain creatures under the ocean as well, right? So, those things are sort of autonomous, right? But at some point, let's go the evolution route, and this autonomous creature crawled out of the water, what they call the primordial ooze, and was the first sort of land-based animal, all right, which then became birds, reptiles, mammals, plants, and everything you see around you, okay? Which one evolved first? So let's say it crawled out of the ocean, but plants hadn't evolved. What did it eat? You with me? So this is a thing. So there's another argument, if you look at the book of Genesis, that they say, I haven't read it myself yet. I've just heard it said. I'll have to check up on it myself. But they say God created the plants and the this and this, and then created the sun. How did the plants survive without the sun? You know what I mean? But we have an answer for that, because we know that God is light. And God could have sustained that with his own presence until he had created what he needed to create to sustain it himself. So you see, when we read Genesis, or we read the Bible, let's say the entire Bible, right? You've got to come from 2 different points of view, all right? And these are the 2 points of view that you have to come from when you read the Bible. If you're a skeptic, all right, you have to presuppose, in other words, your worldview has to be based on an idea that nothing supernatural is possible. If you want to come from the disproving side of the equation of the argument. So, in other words, when you read the Bible and you read about a miracle, then you automatically assume it's a load of hogwash, because there's no such thing as supernatural. It can't exist. If you come from our perspective, we automatically assume that miracles are possible and that the supernatural is only supernatural because we can't explain it. You understand where I'm coming from? So there were a lot of things that happened in the world centuries ago that were classed as supernatural because we couldn't explain it, but have later on become quite commonplace because we can now explain these types of things. Simple things, shooting stars, things that have happened. Let's take the flood, for instance, you know. A lot of people still dispute that. There's a lot of arguments also for and against it. But let's just say natural disasters, tornadoes, these types of things. People automatically used to assume these were supernatural events, when in fact they were natural events. But then we would come and say, well, even though they were natural events, we can't for sure say that they weren't supernaturally inspired to reach a certain goal for God. You know, like the plagues of Egypt and these types of things, you know, and also when the Israelites were in the desert, where there was a pillar of fire at night or in the day, and whatever it was at night that would guard the Israelites through the desert. So we come from a perspective of we believe that supernatural is possible. Miracles can happen. I think I've said this to you before. If you take the Big Bang from the scientific perspective and you look at it and you say, well, all the nothing got together into a space the size of less than the tip of a pencil, all right? If that all got together and exploded in the Big Bang, and that created matter, which created everything that you see, all right? What would you call that? It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And the reason it's a miracle is because they can't recreate it. They've tried everything in their power. This is where, like, this whole idea of splitting the atom and atomic explosions, this is where it was born. It was born in trying to recreate the Big Bang, because the smallest particle that we have is the atom. It's the smallest particle we can identify. Now there's a new argument that's been presented, which I don't want to go into depth with, but they've always assumed that the atom was a positive charged nucleus surrounded by negative charged electrons, okay? And now they're saying that that's impossible. That's impossible. So what they're now saying is that the atom is now both positive and negative charged, and the electrons are also positive and negative charged, because of the way that they can. This is what quantum physics is that they've now proven that an electron is not really in an orbit, it's in a magnetic field, okay, that is created by the two things spinning around each other, and that electrons can now move from one atom to another atom and operate with that atom while still being at the other atom. So in other words, the electron can coexist in two different realities at the same time. Yeah. So this is what they're starting to understand. So if you guys want to watch an entire, if you really want to get your minds blown, all right? There's a PBD podcast where he interviews Terrence Howard. You guys know the actor Terrence Howard, right? I think actually, yeah, watch that one, please. Because at the end, he also speaks about the P. Diddy, Justin Bieber, blah, blah, blah story, right? Which is even more interesting. But the amazing part, a lot of that stuff, even me, I'm not a science guy, it sort of goes over my head, right? But I get the gist of what he's trying to say, because he's able to translate it into normal language. But they bring the head of, I think it's nuclear physics from NASA, who is a Chinese guy, all right, who's a super brain, okay? And they say, right, Dr., let's say Wu, all right, whatever his name is, okay? Have you read these papers? Yes. What do you think? And he says, well, even though he's presenting the papers clearly from a person who hasn't been educated in a university, his equations and his theories are on point, and in fact tie into a lot of the work I've been doing now without even knowing about this guy. So then you've got to start thinking, all right, what do we know? What is supernatural? What is not supernatural? And what is actually available once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of quantum physics and nuclear physics and these types of things, okay? And when you look at that stuff, how can you look at that and say, well, there's absolutely no design, this is all random? Because every single thing inside your body right now is made up of atoms and is spinning and moving around at Mach speed right now in your body. Those atoms have pulled together and formed molecules. Those molecules have pulled together and formed cells. Those cells have pulled together and formed organs and skin. Skin is an organ, by the way. That's why if you get a tattoo here, it can affect you somewhere else on your body, right? You're aware of that. Your whole skin is an organ. That's why guys will tattoo you, and eventually they'll say to you, listen, the ink isn't taking anymore. I don't know if any of you that have had a lot of tattoos have had that experience where they're trying to get the ink in and your skin just simply tunes. That's it. I'm not accepting any more of this foreign stuff. And then you've got to come back for another session, So your skin is an organ, your brain is an organ, your ears, your eyes, your inner ears. To give you an idea, your eye has got 1 million nerve points that start growing when you're in your mother's womb. 1 million, bro. Nerve points that start growing towards your brain, and your brain starts sending your optic nerve from the brain to your eyes. And those things, 1 million connections, connect perfectly. And if one of those 1 million connections, they meet somewhere in your skull. They come from one side, one from the other side. And they come like this, bro, and then they join. Boom, perfectly. And if one of those 1 million nerves does not connect right, you don't see right or you're blind. By accident. You with me? So it doesn't really make sense, this accident story. If you look at the human body, the most phenomenal machine ever created. There's nothing we can build. We've got robots and these types of things that we're building now, autonomous things. They reckon by 2035, every person will have a personal robot like you have a personal phone. That will do literally everything for you. Everything, really. You know what I mean? And that's what Elon Musk is working towards. It'll be as cheap as a phone, cheaper than a car, and it will be able to literally do everything. Everything. It'll be literally a mechanical human being, with AI. Imagine, eh? We watched that show with Will Smith, iRobot, eh? You actually remember that show, and we thought, this is a load of cuck. You know what I mean? It was entertaining and it was fun to watch, robots running around and a cop that's got this hang up with robots, you know what I mean? This crazy guy, there's always one. And and now, with the technology, we're looking at it and, it's literally, we're on the precipice, we're on the doorstep of it, right? So if we can create something like that in our finite human thinking and understanding, then doesn't it even make more sense? Doesn't it even make more sense that something else would have been able to create us? Also, what they're teaching us in quantum physics is that more and more people are starting to believe it, more and more people are studying it, is that we're living in a construct. In other words, that where we live on Earth is a digital construct, and we are simply gamers, type of gamers, very similar idea, except we're not being controlled and run by machines and all of that. We're living in an autonomous construct. In other words, the construct is a type of AI that can adapt itself to the conditions, but we're literally living, on a CPU, in a construct, a digital construct, more like the Truman Show. It goes more like that type of scene, right? So more and more people, they're saying if you look at reality close enough, you can actually see the digital imprint in reality. This is what I'm reading. I don't know if it's true. I'm just telling you what people are saying and things that I read and because people, the number one thing that man is trying to figure out is why are we here? What are we doing here? And the sad part is man is now, because he's become so clever and so wise, and he started to believe that he knows everything. We know everything, yet we can't keep our own planet alive, and we can't stop people from starving to death, and we can't end war, and we can't do all these types of things. But yet we believe we're the be-all and the end-all of all creation, right? We've elevated ourselves, which is where we've always wanted to be, into the position of gods. That's what we've always wanted to be. We've wanted to run our own show, and we wanted to be our own boss, and we don't want to submit ourselves to anything or anybody but ourselves and our own designed governments and constructs and institutions and things that we build ourselves. We don't want to be answerable to some kind of entity that may or may not be there, and anybody that still believes in that type of stuff is looked at as some kind of retard and dumbass. Okay. However, they still can't answer the question, why? These people, why? You always got to ask this question, In a murder case, in any kind of criminal matter, in fact, in any kind of forensic investigation, without motive, there's no crime. But when you as a prosecutor or a police officer, I arrest Greg, right? We found someone lying in a river, okay? We follow the evidence, right? We find DNA, we find whatever we find. We find he's got a knife on him with blood on it. The person was stabbed. We send that to forensics. We don't know because it takes long to go to forensics. But in the meantime, things are matching up, right? So we don't arrest him, right? We've got the DNA, we've got all of that, but we don't know whose DNA we've got, and we don't know whose blood is on the knife, and we don't know what, right? Now we bring him in because he was, for whatever reason, the evidence leads to him, right? People saw him with the person last. Turns out he was in a business deal with this person that went bad. Now we start looking at motive. You check. Now, when we start establishing motive, that's when we really start taking interest in an individual. You understand? That's why, like, you take, I don't want to bring up news on a camera, but it is news, right? So, who's ever been arrested for Mark Batchelor's killing? Mark Batchelor, the football player. No one. Right? No one. Okay? Was anyone ever arrested for Lucky Dube's killing? Has anyone been arrested for those guys, those two auctioneers, liquidators that were killed on the N1 highway about 3 years ago? No one's ever been arrested for these crimes, man. Because when you look at the crimes, okay, with Lucky Dube, they say it was a failed hijacking. With Mark Batchelor, they say it was a hit, and with those liquidators, they say it was a hit, right? But why? I can tell you now why they're battling to actually grab the people that were involved is in a gangster scenario, all right? Not that Lucky Dube was a gangster, because I don't believe he was an artist, all right? But anywhere where there's lots of money involved, all right? Okay. Who was this guy that got killed in Durban? What was his name? The rapper? Okay. Did they ever arrest a guy for that? Have they arrested a guy? Okay. So let's go there for a second, right? Who did they arrest? Huh? Right. So they arrested the hitmen, right? And has anything else come out of that? So how did they know that those hitmen were the hitmen? Camera. Okay, but I remember I watched that. The had a cap on and he had a mask on. But apparently one admitted. Okay, right. So one admitted to killing him, right? Now the next question is going to be, why did you kill him? And the reason we want to know why you killed him, okay, we've got you killed him, right? But we want to know why you killed him and who paid you to go and kill him. Because they've already know, I'm telling you now, they already know, and they've got an idea of who it is, okay? They would know already, because the first mistake you'll ever make in your life is thinking the police are stupid. If you are driving around committing crimes, and your first thought is the police are stupid, they'll never catch me, that's when you know you're definitely going to get caught. Okay? That's how we all get caught. Myself included. All right? Arrogance. Okay? There's some investigators in the police, you know, don't think these guys driving around in the van that we all make fun of, that cold drink, what, you know what I mean? Don't think that those are the guys that are investigating crime. Those are not. That's visible policing. Those are guys that attend complaints, draw plans for car accidents, work in the charge office, blah, 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 right? Then you got the detective. I'll never forget, Bruce. I'll tell you a quick story, okay? Because it's pertinent to this discussion, right? The why, the motive. Isabel took food to an orphanage here, all right? I'm going to cut the long story short. And a woman came running and jumped in her car and said, help me, help me, help me. He's trying to kill me. And while Isabel was trying to reverse with the car, there were two of the guys from the program, who some of you know, who were with her. And this guy that was trying to kill this woman drove through a property's electric fences, came around and smashed into the back of Isabel's car and jammed her up between his car and a rock that she was parked by at a cul-de-sac, right? And there was nowhere to go. And these two guys from the program jumped out and ran away and left the two women there. Okay? Shocked. All right? And the guy in the car jumped out. He tried to open Isabel's door, and the door didn't open for whatever reason. Okay? That's why I believe in miracles. And then he ran around to the other side. Now, you must understand, this car's got central locking. Eh? Then he ran around to the other side, and the woman thought she was pretty safe because Isabel's door didn't open. And he pulled on her door, and her door opened, and he stabbed her to death right there in the car. Right? And then he ducked. You know? And our guys, as he was running away, the two addicts returned and started throwing rocks at him. Okay? That was their input. Now, while this was going on, I got the call. Isabel was screaming. I rushed there, but at the one intersection, I accidentally took a right instead of a left. If I'd have taken a left, I would have caught him on the spot. All right? But because I had to make a U-turn and get back, I wasn't quick enough. Okay? And the sad part about it is, when I tried to help this woman, everyone was telling me, no, don't help. You could get involved and get accused of something. But I tried to help her anyway. Anyway, cut a long story shorter. This guy disappeared, right? And no one had an idea why he'd killed this woman. No one knew who he was. And then the police, turns out her husband was a colonel in the Hawks. Okay? And he came here and he spoke to me, and we gave him the info, and then this guy started digging, and then he got a team together. It's his wife, bud. Right? And then it turned out that she was having an affair with a guy, and then they identified the guy, and then they got a picture of the guy, and then they started looking for the guy, and then they caught the guy. It took them 6 months, and they gripped him. And then they did an ID parade, and Isabel didn't want to go, and I said, we definitely put in this Oak in jail. You understand what I'm saying? And I went with her, and she did the ID parade and that, and she gave evidence, and the lawyers gave her all kinds of cuck. But the motive was, she was ending the relationship because she still loved her husband. And he couldn't accept that, and he'd come there to try and pour petrol on her and set her alight, and she jumped out. And then he chased her down with a knife, and a normal serrated steak knife. Okay. But what fueled the investigation is why? You know, this is why a lot of questions that have arisen in a lot of things that have happened in South Africa, where they come to people's houses, the people are found, in the condition they found, and nothing's taken. And this is why people are talking about hate crime and these types of things, right? You always have to ask why. When I see you guys walking around here, you can ask the guys that have been here a while, staff, why is he there? Why? Like, why did this guy get away last night? You understand? Not that we're a prison, and like I said, we're not here to try and force people to stay here against their will. If he really wanted to leave, why didn't he just come to the office, fill in his papers, and make sure that people don't get in trouble here, that he's supposed to be on the program with, and are supposed to be some of them his mates, right? Yeah. Why would he make a decision to sneaky, jump over the wall and run away? And he's an adult grown man. We're not talking about student here. You with me? You've got to ask why. All right? So, and the whys will only come later. The number one reason why is because I want to continue with my drug use. That's ultimately always the why with us. Why did this all come into being? What's the plan here? So why I said Genesis 1, let's quickly read it. Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. Right? And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. And God called the dry ground land. And the gathered waters He called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit and seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plant-bearing seed, according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. And this is where people argue, because they say, how could there be morning and night with no sun? You understand what I'm saying? How could there be vegetation with no sun? You understand? And this is where there's a whole massive argument about, well, was the earth really created in 6 days, or is it just is it a myth, whatever it is, okay? Now, you got to decide, you got to choose for yourself, if whether you want to believe that it was literally 7 24-hour days, or whether it was spaces of time or whatever it is. But base your decision on some study and go and look into it. I know what I believe, okay? But I don't want to skew you guys, all right? I know what I believe. Oh, well, let me tell you what I believe. I believe it because it's the Bible, regardless of anything else. I'm dogmatic in that, all right? In other words, people say, oh, but you're crazy, the science, the science. That's okay, that's fine. That's cool. I hear you, and I understand what you're telling me. You understand? But I choose to believe the guy that wrote this under inspiration of what God told him. Because if this is what God says, regardless of how it all happened, this is what happened. You with me? So whether you want to believe one day was 6 billion years or one day was 24 hours, that's up to you. But you must go look at the evidence that's available. People say that the modern Homo sapien has been on Earth 150,000 years plus, right? But if you take 150,000 years times the amount of people that are on Earth now, and you work out that birth rate from now to back then, and you say, right, the birth rate is, let's say, 3.9% increasing at 1% per annum over 150,000 years. Some mathematicians have come forward and said if human beings are 150,000 years old or older, all right, that there would be 6 people per every square foot on Earth, oceans included. But if you count back the amount of people at the same ratios, all right, to ultimately 2 people, all right, it goes back approximately 10,000 years. So this is what I'm saying to you. There's arguments on both sides. You understand? Don't just look at one argument, because there's a lot of arguments that completely shoot the scientific argument and blow it out of the water. People will find fossils and say, "Oh, this is proof that we evolved," but there's no proof of any kind of half-evolved creature. Do you understand? We got this, and then we got that, and then all of a sudden we got that, but There's not one that's half this and half that and half that and half this. You with me? So we could be looking at, for all intents and purposes, if you really want to present an argument, we could be looking at fossils of extinct types of ape. Because there's nothing on this planet. Yes, we share genetics with primates. We do, absolutely. But we also share genetics with fish, and we share genetics with, this is what's fueled this natural selection mindset, is that we must have come from fish because we share genetics with fish. No, you know what I mean? Okay, look at it like this, right? Let me try to give you a simple example. Okay, cars, all right? Okay? That's a Ford Ranger, all right? Okay, what does it share with a Lamborghini Hurricane? It's a car. In other words, they're both cars, all right? But they're completely different cars. You can't say that, all right, let me give it to you like this. Let's take the Lamborghini Hurricane and go do the Paris-Dakar with it, but do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, they come off the same blueprint. The blueprint is the blueprint. If you look at creation, right, the blueprint is, let's say for mammals specifically, right? Skin, fur, heart, lungs, kidneys, bladder, stomach, brain. That's it. That's the blueprint, right? Okay. Now, once I got the blueprint, all right, now I'm going to make other things with the same blueprint, but I'm going to make something with the same blueprint to control all of these other things. You know, I'm busy reading a book now, Sapiens, and, you know, this is like the origins of man, okay? And when you read this book, all right, you're like, brother, you know, the amount of guesswork and supposition, you know, when they say things like, it freaks me out when people say this. Me, as a you know, that's one thing. I don't think the Bible is irrational. Eh? It's an exceptionally rational book, all right? So you can't argue against the Bible on the terms of rationality, because it's exceptionally rational. And I'm going to show you now. But for me, it's irrational for a person to sit and say, it is assumed, based on certain archaeological discoveries on civilizations and the fossil record, that the average first upright humanoid type animal that could have been classed as a human being existed 52, are you ready for this, bro? Million years ago. Listen, brother, it is impossible to make that call. First of all, carbon dating is not accurate. They've proven it, bro. And you know who's proven it? Geologists that do geology for mines, for coal specifically. Because they find coal in places where coal should not exist. Because coal is created over hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years through compression and decay. Right? So they cannot say, right, we assume we'll find coal there. But they're finding coal closer and closer and closer to the surface. To the point where they even open cast mining coal. Most of the coal now is open cast mining. So they often find things that shouldn't be where science tells them it should be, is what I'm trying to say to you. Like they found a tree, right? They found a tree. They were digging for coal. This is why I speak about it, because this I read many years ago. And a lot of the stuff I would have to re-look up to be fact-checked, okay? But I read a thing many years ago that they were busy surveying for coal, and then they decided, right, we're going to start digging here for coal. We found coal. And they started digging, and they found a fossilized tree, all right? Still upright, okay? But according to the strata that the tree was found in, all right, and where they found the coal was supposedly had been there, let's say, I don't know what the exact number figure is, but a couple 100,000 years, that's where they found the coal, right? Now, for that tree to be in 10 different strata, 500,000 years, 400,000 years, 200,000 years, 300,000 years. That means that tree would have had to have died over a space of, let's say, 1,000,000 years in parts, is the way they explained it. If they'd have found the tree lying in the coal, different story. But the tree was still upright. So the top of the tree was dated X amount of years, and the bottom of the tree was dated X amount of years, which meant that the tree lived for hundreds of thousands of years and died systematically, which is not possible. You know, these types of things. They found dinosaur footprints, right? Somewhere in America, like in the Grand Canyon or somewhere, right? Or it might even have been in Europe. But they found dinosaur footprints, and inside the dinosaur footprints, they found human footprints. So people were saying, like, yeah, dinosaurs died out long before people. But there's certain evidences that say, well, you know, we don't know for sure. But is that so? Then we read the Bible and we read about dinosaurs and dragons. All right? Okay? And we think, dragons, what's this Game of Thrones cuck? You know what I mean? But the reality is that they found alligators and crocodiles, bro, that are so big that a human being would easily call that a dragon. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, we don't know. This is what I'm trying to say. All right? But to just claim that the Bible is irrational because they say certain things that your scientific brain, your natural brain, you that's trapped in the natural world, can't understand, and just say, well, it's irrational because, dragons. You know, they talk about, the Bible talks about a thing called Leviathan, which is a sea dragon, right? And, there's been a lot of speculation on this, what type of rubbish is this? Except now, as we get cameras and all these types of things, now we're starting to find whales floating in the ocean that have been bitten in half. Blue whales, but not little dinky doy whales. Blue whales, bitten in half. Ships that are found with massive chunks taken out of the side of them. Other ships that they say have been sunk by something of unknown origin. And this is now fueling speculation that Megalodon is still around, You know what Megalodon is, eh? The massive, how many times bigger than a great white? Like 100 times, 10 times. Yeah, like a great white is the size of that thing's tooth. That type of size. Massive, eh? Tissue. So, we don't know. Anyway, where I want to go with this, I'm running out of time. We have this whole story of the creation, right? Okay? In Genesis, right? Now go for me to John chapter 1, verse 1. So, Genesis chapter 1, the whole creation, up to end of Genesis 3, the creation of man, the fall of man, sin, tree of knowledge of good and evil, all that stuff, right? Kicked out of the Garden of Eden, blah, blah, blah. We travel through approximately, I think it's about 4,000 years of history, all right? Through the Old Testament, right up to the New Testament. And then we get to John chapter 1, verse 1, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right? So a guy here is paraphrasing. John is paraphrasing Genesis. But now he adds something interesting, and he says, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? Okay? He was with God in the beginning. Through Him, all things were made. Without Him, nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind, the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Right? Now you might think, what's this all about? Okay? Now, if I quickly just want to look up here. Right? Which very few people pick up on. Everybody thinks about the apple tree in the Bible, eh? Right. So now you think, what is this? So now we go quickly back to Genesis, right? You don't have to go there. I'll go there because it's faster for me. And we go to Genesis 3:22, right? And Genesis 3:22 says, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing of us in knowing good and evil. Okay, that's not the one I want. I just want to find the exact scripture. Right. The reference to the tree of life in Genesis 3 is found in Genesis 3. AI is quite lekker here. 3:22 to 24. This passage describes God's decision to banish Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden after they disobeyed his command and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God fears they might also take from the tree of life and live forever. Okay? So in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. Nothing was made without the Word. Right? Now, when they were in the garden, before they got kicked out, why didn't they eat of the tree of life? Yeah, they told not to eat of the tree of good and evil. Why didn't he tell them you don't need to worry about the tree of life? Don't eat of the tree of life. Why was the tree of life only a concern after they were kicked out? You see, a lot of whys here. Man. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'll tell you why. Because when they were in Eden and they were in paradise and they were living with God, they were living forever already. So as part of the curse that came with sin, all right, death came in, and God wanted man to experience consequence for his disobedience. Okay, so that's why you live and you die. All right, now because of this. Okay, but now we look at this whole thing. We've gone Genesis, now we've gone through the whole Old Testament. All right. Now in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and we got Jesus now, right? Okay. Now I want you to explain to me how we went from, why, not how, why we went from Genesis chapter 1, all right, through this whole rigmarole of the Old Testament to John, or to the New Testament with the coming of Christ. Why has God done that? Okay, so in order to answer that question, because I can see I've got 1,000 people clamoring to answer, okay? You've got to understand, all right, as best we can, because we're fallible human beings. But what we can understand, what we make out from the entire canon of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, is the why of what God is trying to do here. Is the why. Why? Why is God doing this? Why? All right. So the first place you've got to ask yourself is, we read Genesis chapter 1, right? Why did God create the earth? Why did God create plants? Why did God create the universe? Why did God create man? Why? What's the purpose? Go. Worship Him. Which brings what? So when we read Genesis, it says, I created X, Y, Z, and it was good. Who said that? Who said it was good? God Himself. All right? So who's God glorifying? So God is creating something, looking at it and saying, God is good. Right? So you build some fantastic thing. You look at it, right? Life-changing thing. You look at it, you are, well, that thing's lekker, which means I'm sweet. You know, look what I did. You know, or you paint some beautiful thing. People walk past and go, whew, that is amazing. You know, this is why we've got these attributes of God in us, right? And then you look at it and say, you know, that is actually pretty good. I'm actually quite a good artist. You give yourself some self-glorification, right? So that's an attribute we have. Or am I lying? Hey? Guys that play football. Okay, not our football team. our football team only knows what their own goal looks like. All right? They've never seen the other team's goal. Okay? They don't even know if the other team's got a goal. They've heard about it. It's some phantom thing that the other team has. They say it looks like their one, but they've never seen it. All right? Alan wants to see it because he's a collector of goals. He's a goalkeeper. He keeps all the other people's goals. Okay? But, I lost my train of thought now, right? Okay? But let's say you're a brilliant football player. You're like Lionel Messi, right? Okay? And you know, my personal favorite, old Cristiano. Okay? But the thing is that you're so good, bro. And you look at some of the goals. You play a game against another top-level team. Let's say, you know, it's Real versus, I don't know, Benfica or whoever, right? Top-level teams, right? And they play. And you score 3 goals and you come out and you can't understand why people are going crazy, right? And then they say, but you know what you just did? You know, just have a look at the highlights package, you know, and you look at the goals and you think to yourself, yes, bro, I'm actually flipping good. You know, and that builds confidence and all those things in you as a human being, you know. God doesn't need confidence. He's wholly confident. He's completely confident. But you give yourself some self-glorification. Like even me, I'll be, you know, this is, you know, coming from where we come from. I promise you, brother, when you're 8-9 years clean, all right, and you look at what you've been able to build in that 8 or 9 years versus the 0 that you've managed to build during all the years of your addiction, and you check the short period of time it actually takes to do something right and positive versus those years that you were unable to do it, you're going to look at yourself and you're going to go, you know what, you're actually not too bad. You know, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a prideful, oh, you know, I'm so fantastic. No. Just like, wow, that's actually quite amazing. And you give yourself some personal gratification, some self-glorification. So the reason God did all this was for his own glorification, right? Okay? So we understand that, all right? Now he creates man, okay? Now, does God know man is going to sin? How does he know? Huh? He's got it. It's all-knowing. So before God established the beginning, he was already at the end. How about that? Right? So you look at a situation that's been really, let's say, terrible and traumatic in your life, right? Don't be surprised when that thing that you thought was going to end you, right? End your reputation, end your life, end you, bro, in every aspect of your life. Don't be surprised when it's that very thing, all right, that turns out to be your greatest asset 20 years down the line. Our problem is we live in the here and now, right? We judge everything by the here and now, right? We look at these things that are happening around the world and these wars and all these terrible things, and we say, wow, these are terrible things, and they are terrible things. I mean, people are suffering greatly, okay? But when we start understanding that there's a purpose to all of this suffering, there's a purpose to it, man. There's a reason why it's happening. Then you start giving the suffering meaning. You see, if suffering doesn't have meaning, then it's just suffering, and it's the worst kind of thing ever. But when you find people in suffering, right, you're then able to give them a thing called hope. So without suffering, there can't be hope. You check. And it's the hope that pulls people out of suffering. This is why we're sitting in situations in the world where there's wars, right? And if we don't correct things even in our own country, where we're continually giving the vast majority of our countrymen false hope, and their hope keeps getting crushed, and their hope keeps getting crushed, they're going to seek other avenues to attain what they need to attain just as basic human rights. You with me? And that creates wars and violence, okay? which creates more suffering. All right? And this is what's going on in the world, okay? Worldwide, all right? So when we start understanding that we have to put meaning to suffering in order to make suffering meaningful, okay? Then we start understanding that there's hope. And where does the hope come from? The hope comes from a thing that we call ultimate justice. Ultimate justice. So when we look at planet Earth, we see a lot of people getting away with a lot of stuff, and will always get away with it, and will never be prosecuted, and will die of old age. No problem. And I'm talking about the most heinous of people. Child molesters, murderers, rapists, these types of guys. You know, they're out there now committing crimes and will never get caught, because there's a lot of people that will never get caught. Okay? But if we don't have hope that at some point after this life, that person is going to meet justice, then the suffering of the people that is harmed is meaningless. You see? Now we go, did God know that they were going to sin? Yes. How did he know? He's all-knowing. But in a certain way, they were set up. Because sometime before that, there'd been another guy that was also a worshipper of God, who did the same thing. He sinned in heaven. And because God cannot be around and tolerate sin, he expelled him from heaven. And guess where he landed? On earth. Because it says, the earth was without form and void. But it says in Isaiah or Jeremiah, in a vision, the prophet saw Lucifer being cast out of heaven like a lightning bolt and falling to earth. Which means the devil was on this desolate planet already. If you struggle to understand this is why you got to believe in supernatural, right? Watch the movie Thor. Okay? It'll give you an idea of this interdimensional play. You know, I'm not saying take Thor now as verbatim gospel. Just, it gives you an idea. Combine that with like The Matrix and these types of shows. You know, these thought processes come from people's minds. And where does that start? You understand? How is it possible for people to even conceptualize this stuff? You've got to ask that, right? So God now creates all this stuff, but the devil is already here. But, all right? We call him the devil. But he's an entity. He's an entity. But he's different to God because he came into the natural like that, same as Jesus came into the natural. He had to take on an anthropomorphic shape. So the devil walks among us. And he's super powerful, but he doesn't have God's power. Do you understand? Now, God creates man, knowing the devil is there, right? Because God wants glorification of himself. Now, he can already glorify himself, but he wants glorification from his creation. He wants, like most men, he wants a family. He wants kids that he can look after. He wants kids to... You know, you ask any father, the most thing, I haven't had the privilege, but even with my grandkids, right? You know, my grandkids, they look at me like a superhero. But do you understand what I'm saying? And that's what fathers want. They want their kids to love them and idolize them and feel safe around them. And, you know, if they've got problems, come to them. And, you know, you want to be a father to this child, like I want to be a grandfather to these grandkids, right? So, you know, that's what God wanted. Now, we've got that in us as well. So it's easy for us to understand that, right? But you don't want a kid around you that's forced to be around you. So what does the kid have? What does Adam and Eve have? They have options. Options. God gives them options. And God has given us options right through history. When you look at the entire history of how God chooses Israel and Abraham and all of that stuff, right? God continually gives us options, and we continually choose the wrong options. And then God makes a plan to rescue us, and then He sets things right, and then a couple of meters down the road, we're making the wrong choices and the wrong options. And eventually, the options and the choices that we make are activating this thing called sin to such a level, all right, that man has become completely and totally corrupt, and there's actually no more hope for mankind to be God's children. And then God brings the master plan. God brings Jesus Christ, the master plan, all right, to reconcile His creation to Him. That's what this whole thing is about. But the why of it, right up until the end of Revelation, okay, is for God to continue in the process of His own glorification. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you serve a narcissistic God. Well, my friend, I really hope, for your sake, that when you die and you face this God, that you tell Him that yourself. Because if you read the biblical versions, of what God is so big, so powerful. We think we're clever because we discovered the atom. Think about the one that created the atom. We're operating on theories and theorems and mathematics. It's taken us thousands and thousands of years and thousands of people to get the understanding that we've got now. This entity that we've named God, Yahweh, Elohim, Jehovah Jireh, you know what I mean? God the provider, this entity, we've given Him a name, He gave Moses his name. He says, my name is YHWH, right? And then other people, sort of added onto that name to try and explain the magnitude, the glorification, the size of this God. They try with words. There's not enough words to explain this entity. But we try in our limited vocabulary to try and explain this entity. And now you want to walk around and, sort of call names, in your limited capacity as this little thing. You're a little squidgy organism, but that popped up here a couple of years ago, and a couple of years from now you're going to be feeding these plants, but you're going to be ash, dust. And yet we're so wrapped up in our self-importance. You with us? Like we're the be-all and end-all of everything. You as an individual sitting there, there's not a thought that you have in your mind where you're not the superhero in the thought, where you're not the master of the plan, where you're not the one pulling the strings. All of us, when we think about an action movie, we watch an action movie. That's why we love action movies. We watch Denzel in Man on Fire. Hey, my man, I'm the man on fire. I'm not the Colombian guy that tried to kidnap the girl that got smoked in scene 2. I'm the man that's why we love these movies. I'm Superman. I'm Spider-Man. I remember when we were kids, we would watch Bruce Lee movies, Enter the Dragon. Wah-wah! And then you come out of that movies theater in Primrose and 25, 10-year-olds are flipping, muttering each other. Wah-wah, wah-wah, wah-wah. We're all Bruce Lee. When you go play, then it's like, I want to be Bruce Lee. No, I'm Bruce Lee. No, you can be the oak with the funny talent. I don't want to be that oak. He does. You understand? You're always the superhero in your own mind. But in reality, you're just a human being, and you're only here for a period of time. Now, when you understand the why of God's whole purpose in this thing, okay, and we'll water this down when we go further later, okay. Now you've got to water it down to, why am I here? What is God's plan for me? If God's master plan is His own glorification and the reconciling of man to Himself through the blood of His Son, Jesus Christ, then what is my purpose? Why am I here? Why was I born? And how do I fulfill that criteria of God's glorification? The problem is we are all too busy with our own glorification. A. And B, seeking pleasure through the things of the world. And those things, our own glorification and seeking the world's ways and pleasures of the world, are in absolute, complete contradiction to what God has got or what God's plan is for our life. All right. And we'll get more into that type of stuff later. Okay. Did that help anybody? Lekker. Sweet. Have a lekker day, boys.